who were living in a household with a mom who was extremely saved. And I thank God, and this will sound crazy to a lot of people, but I thank God that my mom wasn't saved then, because I was able to be exposed to stuff that other people couldn't be exposed to. So my cousins loved coming to stay with me, because at their house, they couldn't watch BET and MTV. So when they came over, I had already seen the episodes of Beavis and Butthead, but they wanted to sit and watch the cartoon all day long. But then in the 90s, cartoons began developing to movies. And there was a movie that really spoke to the black community specifically, because it's a very comical movie, but the realities of the movie speaks directly to our community. And in that particular movie, there was a little baby that was played by the voice of Tone Low. And, in that movie, it's called Bebe's Kids. It was a cartoon that spoke to the misbehavior of black kids from the hood. And some of y'all, if you've never seen it, don't let your children watch it now. You got to wait till they're 16, because there's some language in there that's quite vigorous and quite defensive. But in that particular cartoon, one line that has always stuck with me is when the stepdad-to-be was coming and hanging out with the woman that he wanted to date, and she had brought along her sister's children. Everything he did in his power was to try to make them laugh, make them smile. He took them to a theme park, and it was probably the worst decision that he ever made. But one of the lines in that movie that sticks with us, that is the topic of this sermon, is that the little baby, out of all children, looked around and said to him, "We don't die, we multiply." And it may have taken on a negative connotation at the time, but if you can just flow with me for a moment, that line has stuck with me since I was in my teen years watching that movie, Bebe's Kids, even to now, because it speaks to the realities of my life and to some of your lives, that no matter what the enemy throws at us, no matter how much the enemy brings your way, no matter how many trials and tribulations that you go through, you may have been broke, you may be hurt, you may have gone through all kind of chaos and turmoil, but the reality is you can look the devil in the face to face, and let him know we don't die, we multiply. And really only a few people can get that that's ever been through anything, but about only a few people that can speak to this reality, because they've been through some things where anybody else would have went through what you went through. They would have been done. It would have been over for them. They would have passed out. They would have gave up. But aren't you glad that God made you the way that God made you? I can preach it here. Aren't you glad that God built you the way that you're built? Because there's people that went through sickness and they died from it. Somehow, some way, by the grace and mercy of God, you still survive. There's people that have bills in over their head and they lost their mind because of it, but somehow you got a penny from over here and a penny from over here. You rubbed together and you made them work. Aren't you glad that you're built exactly the way God built you? That what killed other people, what took other people out, destroyed them, what made them lose your mind, made you multiply. That's good right there to me, because I just made up in my mind that I don't care what I had to go through, how I had to get here. I'm just glad that I made it in the Impact Center on this morning. I know you went through chaos all week long. You had to argue. You might have had to fight. You had to cuss and ask for repentance, but somehow, some way, you made it in the house, and that's only because you don't die, you multiply. Can you high five somebody around you and say it with some confidence in your voice that you don't die, you multiply. It's interesting because as we make this journey and we look toward this new journey in Exodus, we're awakened by sadness. Joseph has died. In Genesis chapter verse 26, after this long journey with Joseph, Joseph has finally died. He's died, according to Genesis 50 and 26, at the age of 110. And we met Joseph when he was 17 years old in Genesis chapter 37. So now we have literally covered 93 years of Joseph's life. But in Genesis chapter 50, verse 26, the brother has died. So we're seemingly awakened by sadness at the death of Joseph. And then when we look at our text in Exodus chapter 1, we find out in verse 6 that all of Joseph's brothers have died and an entire generation with Joseph have died. So in Genesis, the end of it, Joseph has left us. And now in Exodus chapter 1, verse 6, his brothers have died and a generation has died. And one translation of the Bible says to us or suggests to us that a new king has come into power in Egypt that knew nothing about Joseph. He knew absolutely nothing about Joseph, which means that this has erased Joseph's legacy. This is the same Joseph family that spoke and interpreted a dream to the Pharaoh of Egypt at the time. This is the same Joseph that used his own intellect and wisdom to save the land of Egypt, but now all of that has been forgotten. And it's almost a matter of how quickly we forget. Even myself, when I use sports as an analogy or as an example, as much as I love LeBron James and as much as I think he's the greatest basketball player of all time, it's almost like how quickly we forget how great Michael Jordan was. Or even in the entertainment world, I hear people say all the time now that Beyonce is the greatest entertainer of all time. But it's almost a matter of how quickly we forget how amazing Tina Turner and Michael Jackson and Prince were. So it's almost a matter of how quickly we can forget. And that is just a matter that happens in our lives with celebrities. But that happens in our everyday lives because many of us, it seems as if when the new hot thing comes, we jump ship and we join that new thing, forgetting about how good things have been to us before. See, some of y'all are looking at me real crazy because when a new trend comes, you jump ship and jump on that trend and you forget how good you really had it. Well, let me drop this nugget on you real quick. Don't allow the emotions of a trend to cause you to erase the legacy of someone or something from your past. Okay, let me rewind that. Don't you allow your emotional self, our emotional selves, to hop on every single new trend that comes along, and we forget about the legacy of the people and the things that's from our past. Because the reality is, and some of us won't say this, everybody from your past ain't all bad. And isn't it interesting how every year around New Year's, we start cutting people off, or every time a relationship ends, you want to erase the legacy, but you can't forget everything wasn't so bad because you wouldn't have stayed there so long if it was. Yeah. So you have to remember, don't jump ship on every trend. Make sure you keep the stuff, the legacies from your past, because everything and everybody from your past ain't all bad. Joseph, his brothers, and a whole generation have died. Joseph's entire legacy has been erased. And a new Pharaoh or a new king of Egypt has come in, and he's in power, and it says that he knew nothing about Joseph. Joseph's legacy has been erased, and out of fear, this new king of Egypt starts oppressing the Israelites, the Hebrews, which are the children of God. So he starts oppressing them. In fact, he makes them work harder. He increases their work because now they're working with brick and mortar. He makes their lives miserable and bitter. He increases everything in their life. And the reality is, when you look at the Israelites, the Hebrews, the children of God, they should have been living in fear. Because think about this. Everything that was easy work has become tough work. The labor has gotten tougher. Their lives are now miserable because of this new king. So they should have been living in fear. In fact, if I could push it a little bit farther, the Egyptians were supposed to be superior to God's people. Because these are Hebrews, these are Israelites. They were not allowed to sit at the table with the Egyptians. They were supposed to be inferior to the Egyptians. So the reality is they have multiple reasons why they should be afraid and living in fear. But what's to shout about is that the text never tells us, and it never mentions that the Israelites, the Hebrews, that God's children are living in fear. I promise I'm going to get to it. They have multiple reasons why they should be living in fear. But the text never mentions them ever living in fear. And that's because, number one, you don't have to live in fear when you have a promise from God. Let me show you. The promise began, God gave the promise to Abraham. It was confirmed by Isaac and Jacob. And even though Joseph is the promised child and his legacy has been erased, the promise of God wasn't erased. Because watch this, you can erase legacy, but you can't erase the promise of God. And this is why that's important to us. So people can come in your life, they can talk about you, Dre, they can come up against you, fight against you, dislike you, oppress you, but one thing they cannot do is erase the promise of God that's on your life. Well, Craig, what is the promise of God? God promised you that you shall be the lender and not the borrower. God promised you that you should be above and not beneath. God promised you that you shall be the first and not the last. So as long as you got the promise of God, nothing the enemy can do can erase that promise. So now you don't have to press back. People talk about you and attack you and come at you because they may destroy your legacy, but they can't destroy God's promise. And as long as you hold on to the promise of God, you don't ever have to walk in fear. You don't ever have to talk in fear. Because why? Because you don't die, you will multiply if you hold on to the promise of God. Because here it is, family. Holding on to the promise of God keeps you away from fear. So you don't have to fear, Minister Cowan, failure. You don't have to fear having sickness. You know why? Because you have a promise from God. And as long as you have the promise of God, you don't have to worry about fear. So many of us right now experience fear in our life because we have not grabbed hold to the promise of God. You got to go back in the Word and read every promise that God gave you. God said, I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. That's a promise for riches. God said, I'll supply all of your needs according to my riches. That's a promise. You got to visit the promises of God. And when the devil starts attacking you, when the devil starts messing with you, when the devil starts rocking you, you got to remind the devil, you may destroy my legacy, but you can't destroy my promise. I have a promise on my life. I have a promise on my children's life and my children's children. You got to understand, I got to hang on to the promise, and it'll keep you from walking in fear. The reality of this is the Israelites, the Hebrews, which are the children of God, they should be living in fear. Because the new Pharaoh has come in and he's erased the legacy of Joseph, who was the only one that connected the Egyptians and the Hebrews to God. So they should be easily walking in fear. They should be in fear because they're supposed to be inferior to the Egyptians. They should be living in fear because their labor has increased, and now they're working in brick and mortar, and the King James Version says that the work has become rigor, has become tough and strenuous, so they should be living in fear. But the reality is they're not living in fear because, number one, you don't have to live in fear when you have a promise from God. Watch this, family. For 200 plus years, for more than 200 years, while Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were living, the Israelites, which are the children of God, they produced few in number. Because remember, the promise was that they would be numerous. But when they go to Egypt, they only took 70 people. Okay, I'm teaching y'all for a moment. God promised Abraham over 200 years ago that our descendants would be as numerous as the stars and the sand on the sea. But we only take 70 people. Okay, y'all not doing your math. Y'all acting like y'all in the wrong class right now. Rode a different bus. Here, we'll be as numerous as the stars and the sand on the sea, but we only take 70 people into Egypt. Well, how do we only produce 70 people in 200 plus years? Here it is. But when they get to Egypt, it says that they keep multiplying and multiplying and multiplying. And they put them in slave, they multiply. They changed their workload and they multiply. They started beating them and they multiplied. They started oppressing them and they multiplied. Can I just bring it home real quick? Can I bring it home? So your bills increased, but you kept multiplying. Your car note got in over your head and got behind by 4 payments, but you still ate good. You kept multiplying. Things started happening. Relationships started ending. Problems started coming. But somehow, by the grace of God, you kept multiplying. And what the devil thought was going to kill you, it made you multiply. Watch what happens. For 200 plus years, they produce 70 people. But when they get to Egypt, when the pressure comes, when the oppression comes, it says they multiplied. And what they couldn't do in 200 plus years, they did in less than 60. I just want to drop this on you real quick. What you're going through right now is not to take you out, but force you to produce. They don't have to walk in fear because they have a promise of God. And trade, the reason they're able to produce when they're facing turmoil is because they are now living in the promise that was given 200 years ago. And can I speak over some of your lives right now? You're getting ready to live in the promise, not of you, but the promise that was gave to your grandmama, the promise that was gave to your granddaddy. And now it's getting ready to manifest through you. But the catch is you got to endure that you go through now so you can make the promise come forward. And some of us give up too easily because we go through a hard time. But do I got any witnesses in here right now that no matter how hard it's going to get, you're going to make sure that you endure because you have a promise? The only reason they're not living in fear is because, number one, you don't have to fear when you have a promise from God. They should be living, Minister Cowan, in fear. Shavante, they should be in fear because they're supposed to be inferior to this race. They're supposed to be less than. They can't eat at the same table. There's a new king in town who don't know nothing about your people, Donald Trump. You're supposed to be living in fear. But the Bible never says in this text, it never mentions that they're in fear because, number two, you don't have to live in fear when you're connected to God-fearing people. Let me show you. The new king, he enslaves the people and he realizes it doesn't kill them. He changes their workload and makes it tougher, but realizes it doesn't kill them. He takes them from the comfort of their homes and moves them from nice homes and shuts down Black Wall Street and moves them to the ghetto and the projects, but it doesn't kill them. He oppresses them. He tries to take their worship, but it doesn't kill them. Doesn't that sound like some of us in the room right now? That the devil has tried to use people to throw everything at you, but you wake up every morning and it makes the devil mad because the devil don't know how you can endure what you endure innocently, and somehow you woke up, somehow you made a way because God was on your side. So now the devil is upset because everything the devil tried to throw at you, you just avoided it like the Matrix. And now somehow, some way, the devil is upset, but God helped you make a way. Aren't you glad that you experienced some of the stuff that you experienced and realized and woke up and said it didn't kill me? Yeah, I guess I'll just preach this thing as good as it feels. I'm so glad for all the stuff I had to go through in my life. I know it's been hard, it's been tough, it wasn't easy growing up in the projects, but I'm glad I went through it because made me the person that I am today. It made me strong. It made me able to endure because everything the devil threw at you, it can kill you. Y'all don't know when to catch it right there. Somebody should be glad right now because the cancer didn't kill you. Being locked up didn't kill you. The relationship ending, it didn't kill you. You're here today, so everything you experienced, the alcohol, it didn't kill you. The drugs, it didn't kill you. The sex unprotectedly, it did not kill you. You should be glad, mamas, that on the birth table, it did not kill you. You should be glad that everything the devil threw at you, it did not kill you. Everything this new king is throwing at them, he's trying to make their work harder so they're no longer just cooking and providing dinners. He makes the ones that were in the house go work in brick and mortar. He's oppressing them. He's enslaved them. And it should kill them. It should disconnect them from God. It should have them living in fear. But the reality is they don't live in fear because verse 15 shows us something. When you look at verse 15, he realizes, this new king, this new Pharaoh, realizes, I can't kill these people. The more I try to kill them, the more they multiply. The more I oppress them, the more I put hard labor on them, they keep multiplying. So verse 15 of chapter 1 says, he goes to two of their people. He think he's smart. So during the presidential election, he goes to a church in Detroit. Y'all missing me. And he claps off and tries to pretend like you know the old AME hymns. And the new Pharaoh comes in and he goes and talks to two Hebrew women, one named Sapphira and one named Pure. He says, listen, ladies, I've been trying to get these people under control. But it ain't working. So I realized y'all are the midwives. In other words, 21st century, y'all are the ones that produce the babies. Y'all birth the babies. So I was just wondering, could y'all kill the little boys and let the girls live? Because after all, y'all are ladies. Y'all, I'm trying to tell my story to make y'all understand it. And we got to understand it. The Bible reads differently in our Latin translated to English, right? But the reality of when you look at this in Hebrew, he wasn't telling them like to slaughter murder. He was telling them when the babies are on the stool, the midwives will catch the babies at the bottom of the stool. And what he was telling them is, don't let the parents see you, but strangle them when you bring the baby out. So you catch the baby at the stool and you grab it by the neck as if you're taking it to the mom. And he was telling them to strangle the baby as you bring it up. And when the baby came up, it would be dead. So he was being strategic. We look at it as if he told them to get a knife and just no. He was telling them strategically, catch the baby at the end, choke the baby, and when you bring it up, the boy babies will be dead. That's verse 15. So he's trying to politically control the population. But verse 17, bless me, because Sapphira and Pure, these two women who went to church all their life, they say, the text says in verse 17, they feared God. They had a reverence for God. They had a respect and an honor for God. They believed, I told them in Bible study, they didn't touch the little table that says, in remembrance of me. They didn't run around and do cartwheels on the pulpit. They didn't come and play. Y'all don't know how it was back in the day. Some of y'all that missed Bible study, folk would not cuss on church ground. I cuss everywhere else. Y'all ain't saying nothing. But when I ride past Benner Tabernacle, I'm turning my music down. I'm getting holy and sanctified. I ain't gonna cuss. I'm gonna throw my beer in the back seat because there was a reverence for God. And Sapphira and Pure, they had a fear for God. And they said, nah, we can't do it. We can't kill the seed because we have a fear of God. And watch this and let it bless you. Don't miss point number 2. And the reason that some of us are able to multiply right now is because you've been connected to God-fearing people. I'm a witness, and some of you witnesses, we're only surviving right now by grandmama's prayers. You're only surviving right now by granddaddy's prayers. You're only surviving because of mama and daddy prayers, because some of our prayers hadn't even hit the ceiling yet. So I'm glad for my prayers that haven't hit the ceiling. My grandmama's prayers have already sent smoke signals to God. And some of us right now, you don't realize that the accident that you avoided was because somebody God-fearing was praying on your behalf. But about what should have made you lose your mind stays sane because somebody was praying, because you were connected to God-fearing people. And that's why you don't have to walk in fear. That's why you don't have to be concerned about the attacks of the devil. That's why you don't have to be afraid of failure. That's why you don't have to be afraid of a person, because somebody in your circle is God-fearing and can get a prayer in on your behalf. In April 1982. So I was born November 1983, right? Catch this, November 1983, the 22nd, if you just want to know and write my birthday down. November the 22nd, 1983, on Thanksgiving Day I was born. But in April of 1982, which is almost a year and a half before I was born, my father, let me give you this disclaimer right here. This don't mean try me, but my dad is much like me. We really can't fight. Right? I've won a couple. But most of the fights I won are the ones that never happened, right? So I'm not a fighter like that. I've never been a real fighter. I was good whenever we would jump somebody because, I can jump in. I'm like a 1-2 punch guy. If I don't get you in the first 2, it's over. You're going to whoop me. I have no endurance. My dad is much like that. My uncles would tell me they would beat my dad up. He couldn't fight. He was the most athletic, so they were jealous of him a little bit, so they always beat him up. We couldn't. In April of 1982, my dad is at the club. This story has been told to me. My dad is at the club. He gets in an argument in the club. And he tells them he has a plastic cup in his back pocket. And he's using his talk game because we've been able to talk our way out of a lot of fights. As I just told you, most of the fights I won, Joe, was the ones that never happened. I got talk game. I'll make you think. See, I'm just honest with mine. Some of y'all ain't that honest. I'll make you think that I can go. So my dad has a plastic cup in the back of his pocket. This story's been told to me. And my dad is telling them he got a gun. So he's talking trash. He got a gun. It's a plastic cup. So one of the guys stabbed my father. Stabbed him straight through his lungs, took him in Miami, threw him in a ditch. Left him there to die. Just so happened, I'm not born yet. Y'all gonna miss all of this. I'm not born to November 1983. This is April 1982. So they stab him through his lungs. They throw him in a ditch in Miami. And just so happened, my uncle's friend at 4 a.m. in the morning rides by and sees a body in the ditch. This is Miami. There's a body in the ditch. This is not uncommon. He gets out and he notices that this is his friend's brother. Gets him to the hospital. They call my mama. My mom comes in. My dad's face is covered. They tell her it's over. He's going to die. They call my grandma. Y'all about to miss this. My grandmama is in Baxley, Georgia. Has to get to Hollywood, Florida, down by Miami. They say she gets in a car with my granddaddy. They make it in less than 8 hours. Now, 8 hours previous, they told my mama my dad is dead. Sheet over his head. Grandmama shows up, kicks everybody out the room. And they say my grandmama paced back and forth, her Bible, her oil. She started sprinkling oil. She started praying. She started speaking, and my daddy started coughing. Okay. And here it is. And you got to realize that metaphorically, some of our lives are in the hands of the prayers of those that are connected to God. And let me push this a little bit farther. The devil was trying to kill my daddy because he knew I had to come. Yeah. And if I don't make it, some of you don't get connected. And if some of you don't get connected, other people don't get connected. So if grandmama wouldn't have showed up in Hollywood, Florida, and paced that room and talked to God on behalf of my daddy, my mom and daddy would have never connected on Marvin Gaye in '83, and I would not be here. So sometimes you got to celebrate the fact that God has you connected to people that are God-fearing. And that's why you don't have to walk in fear, because somebody that's connected to God been praying on your behalf too. Somebody's been worshiping. Somebody's been crying on your behalf. And that's why you don't have to fear people. That's why you don't have to fear the devil. That's why you don't have to fear failure. That's why you don't have to fear letdown, because somebody's praying for you. Sapphira and Pure are women who, Logan, we don't talk enough about, because they put their lives on the line because they trusted God. And they stood up to the king and the Pharaoh and told him, no, we won't kill these babies because we fear God. They're supposed to be afraid, but you don't have to be in fear, number two, when you are connected to God-fearing people. They're supposed to be living in fear. They're enslaved. Their workload has changed. They're inferior to this superior group of people, and they're supposed to be living in fear. But again, this text never mentions them living in fear, because number three, and finally, you don't have to live in fear when God shows up. Let me be slightly deep with y'all, and I promise I'm out of your way. Exodus chapter 1 is interesting because for the first 16 verses, God is not mentioned. Okay, y'all ain't been reading your Bibles. You ain't been reading your Bible. For the first 16 verses, no matter what translation you look at, God is not mentioned. But here's the trying part. In those 16 verses is the roughest portion of what the Israelites ever had to go through. Because when you read verses 1 through 16, they have been oppressed not once but twice. But God hasn't shown up. The workload has changed. They've been enslaved, but it doesn't mention God. They've been stripped of their pride. They've been stripped of everything, but it does not mention God. They've been oppressed. They've now broke. They're living hard lives, but it does not mention God. And my question for some of us, have you ever lived a verse 1 through 16 before? Some of y'all, even in your secret place, you may not ever admit it, but there's been times where you looked at your bills, you looked at your marriage, you looked at your relationships, you looked at your friends, you looked at the lack thereof, you looked at your bank account versus your car note or your mortgage, and you might have asked the question, where is God? It's not out of line if somebody reads verse 1 through 16, and if they stop there, it's not out of line to question, where's God? Some of us have lived by grandmama's philosophy. In some areas, it was too much because you are entitled to ask the question. Because my teachers in school told me, you won't ever know if you don't ask. And more than my teachers, the Bible told me, you have not because you ask not. Which means if I don't have the answer, it's because I didn't ask. Verses 1 through 16 is interesting because all the chaos, all the turmoil, all the trouble, all the trial, all the oppression, the hate, the abuse. But God, you ain't speaking. How you let me be abused, God, but you ain't mentioned? How you let me go through this and me and my children be separated, but you ain't mentioned? God, how you let us go from living glamorous lives in Egypt to Joseph being erased and you not mentioned? Let me bring it home. God, how did I go from being a junior in high school and having an incredible vision for my life to being 43 and don't know which direction I'm going, and God, you ain't mentioned? God, you know I didn't desire to do drugs and get strung out on crack or cocaine, but God, you ain't mentioned. God, how did you let me get pregnant before I got married, and God, you ain't mentioned? God, how you allowed me to be sick, but you ain't mentioned? Family, have you ever had a verse 1 through 16 in your life before? That you honestly had to sit there in the house looking crazy and ask God, where are you? But here's the beauty of it. God shows up in verse 17. I got to push this. For 16 verses, God says nothing. Through oppression, through abuse, through hurt, through loneliness, through pain, God is not mentioned. But all it takes, I can't even preach it like I feel it. All it takes is for God to show up in one verse. It says in verse 17, God shows up, and when God is mentioned, the sisters say no. Can I help y'all real quick? When God shows up, watch these three things that happen. The first thing that happens is protection. Because Sapphira and Pure, they're supposed to be put to death for disobeying the king. But when God shows up, they're protected. The next thing that happens is provision. Because watch what happens for Sapphira and Pure. It says because they honor God, their houses were blessed and they had children. Which means these two sisters didn't have kids before that, and they probably didn't have a man before that. I'm about to bless a sister real quick. But when they obey and honor God, and when God shows up, they not only get a man, they get a husband, and they get children, and a household. So here it is, family. I'm telling you right now that God may have not been mentioned in 16 verses of your life, but in one verse, God can show up and erase all 16 and give you protection and give you provision. Let me close it out like this. I don't want to shout you out. I want you to get this. God does not show up to rescue them. Because we know the Israelites, for those of you that have read your Bible in Vacation Bible School when you was growing up, you know that Exodus is the book of exit, which means they have to go into something in order to exit. So when God is mentioned and shows up in verse 17, he didn't come to get them out. He just came to remind them that no matter what you go through, you won't die, you will multiply. And family, I don't really know who this is for today, but I want to encourage you real quick that every time you get in something, God won't show up to bring you out of it, because some stuff you got to endure. There's a lesson in some of the trials. There's a lesson in some of the terrible relationships. There's a lesson in some of the things that you experience, and we can't expect God to always show up to pull us out, but sometimes God is just showing up to remind you that you won't die in this. I don't care what it is. It won't kill you. It won't take you out. You're not going to lose your mind. It may hurt sometimes. You may get lonely. You may get broke, but God is trying to remind you, you won't die. You will multiply. And family, that's why this month as we close, we're going to walk without fear. And we're going to break out of fear, because we don't have to fear when we have a promise from God, when we are connected to God-fearing people, and when God shows up. Everyone standing to your feet. We done.